The first thing Marcus DeJustus felt was the warmth of sunlight pressing against his face. His eyelids slowly opened, expecting to see the gray ceiling of his company vehicle or perhaps the unfinished beams of another construction site. Instead, an endless stretch of brilliant blue greeted him. The sky, not a single skyscraper, not a single power line, only drifting white clouds floating across an impossibly clear horizon. Marcus frowned as he remained lying on the coarse ground. The salty scent of the sea filled the air, accompanied by the rhythmic crashing of waves against stone. What? He slowly raised both hands into the air. They were still his own. The familiar calluses from years of handling blueprints, inspecting buildings, and occasionally helping workers on site were still there. His fingers flexed instinctively as he stared at his palms, searching for an explanation that refused to come. His heartbeat quickened. Marcus pushed himself into a sitting position before lowering his gaze toward his body. He blinked. Still dressed exactly as he had been earlier that morning. A neatly tucked white long-sleeved office shirt, blue jeans, a sturdy pair of steel-toe safety boots, now stained with fine sand. Even the company ID clipped to his chest remained hanging from his pocket, gently swaying with the ocean breeze. This can't be real. His breathing became uneven as memories resurfaced. Only a short while ago, he had been leaving the company's regional office. As the project manager for one of the country's largest real estate developers, another inspection awaited him. A newly acquired construction site was scheduled for groundbreaking, and he intended to review the land personally before approving the initial excavation work. He distinctly remembered stepping into the company vehicle. His phone had been ringing. Someone from engineering wanted clarification regarding the soil reports. Then, nothing. No explosion. No accident. No pain. Only darkness. And now, an island. Marcus slowly stood up, brushing the sand from his jeans. Years of managing construction projects had trained him to remain calm under pressure. Whether facing delayed permits, unstable foundations, or multi-million peso setbacks, panic solved nothing. The first rule was always the same: assess the situation. His eyes swept across the landscape. The island was far smaller than he had expected. Most of the ground consisted of exposed gray rocks mixed with coarse sand. There were only a handful of patches where hardy grass managed to grow between cracks in the stone. No visible buildings, no trees large enough to provide real shelter, no smoke that might indicate other people. The ocean surrounded him in every direction. Endless, silent. Marcus climbed onto a slightly elevated rock, hoping for a better view. Nothing, just waves. The realization slowly settled into his mind. He was completely alone. Where am I? As if answering his question, the air directly before him shimmered. A translucent blue screen materialized out of thin air. Marcus instinctively stepped back. The floating panel resembled the holographic interfaces from science fiction movies. Its edges glowed faintly as lines of text rapidly appeared. Name: Marcus DeJustus. Age: 34. Occupation: real estate development project manager. Specialization: land development, construction planning, infrastructure management. Current location: unknown island. Current status: healthy. Marcus narrowed his eyes. A system? More icons faded into existence beneath his profile, but place. His attention shifted to the second tab: public chat. The words alone suggested one thing: if there was a public chat room, then he wasn't the only one who had arrived in this strange world. Before Marcus could process the thought any further, the blue panel pulsed softly, patiently waiting for his next command. This opening sets up Marcus's engineering and real estate background, which can later become highly relevant when he begins surveying land, planning infrastructure, and eventually building a settlement from a barren, rocky island. Marcus took a slow breath before reaching toward the glowing interface. His finger touched the public chat tab. The screen immediately shifted. Lines of messages rapidly scrolled upward, each bearing different names and timestamps. Open quote: "Is anyone else trapped on an island?" Close quote. "Mine has trees. Does anyone know if coconuts are safe to drink?" Close quote. "I found fresh water. Keep looking around your islands. There's something moving in the water. Don't swim too far." Open quote. "Has anyone figured out what the locked marketplace tab is?" Close quote. The messages continued endlessly. Questions, arguments, panic, speculation. Some begged for help. Others cursed whatever force had brought them here. Marcus quietly closed the chat window. He leaned against a weathered rock and shut his eyes for a brief moment. Panic spread faster than information. He had witnessed it countless times throughout his career. Whenever a construction accident or an unexpected delay occurred, workers often lost focus because they concentrated on fear rather than solutions. Marcus had learned long ago that emotions could wait. Facts came first. He organized his thoughts one by one. First, the public chat confirmed he wasn't alone. Thousands, perhaps even millions, of other people had been transported to islands similar to his own. That meant information existed beyond the limits of his tiny island. Even if he couldn't physically leave, knowledge could still travel through the chat. Knowledge was another form of resource. Second, his eyes drifted toward the third tab. Marketplace. Locked. Interesting. The name alone suggested that acquiring materials from elsewhere might eventually become possible, whether through barter, some form of currency, or a completely different system. He couldn't tell yet. Dollar? Yen? Peso? None of those assumptions mattered. It was far too early to waste time theorizing. The important conclusion was much simpler. There was a possibility that resources wouldn't forever be limited to whatever his island naturally possessed. That possibility alone changed everything. Third, the immediate priorities: shelter, drinkable water, food. Everything else came later. Marcus stood and finally began surveying the island in earnest. His boots crunched over coarse sand before striking exposed stone. The island was disappointingly barren. Small stretches of pale sand connected clusters of gray rocks polished smooth by the sea. There were no trees, no obvious freshwater spring, and no signs that humans had ever stepped foot here before him. Only one feature truly stood out. Near the island's outer edge rose a crescent-shaped formation of weathered stone, curving naturally like a giant protective wall. Marcus approached it. The rock formation covered roughly 30% of the island's perimeter. He observed how its shadow shifted with the afternoon sun. Not enough for rain, he murmured to himself. The overhang offered decent protection from direct sunlight, but the opening remained exposed. A strong storm would easily drench anyone taking shelter beneath it. Still, it was better than standing under the open sky. This will do. It wasn't a home. It wasn't even a proper shelter. But it was a beginning. Eventually, he'd reinforce it, expand it, improve it. For now, surviving the first day took priority. Marcus continued walking. His steady pace soon carried him around the entire island. When he finally arrived back at the crescent rock formation, he glanced at his wristwatch. Barely 10 minutes had passed. A faint smile escaped him. It really is that small. Based on years of estimating land dimensions during site inspections, Marcus mentally calculated its approximate size, a little over 50 square meters, perhaps slightly larger. Tiny. Yet something caught his attention. Along portions of the shoreline, flat rocky shelves extended beneath the surrounding seawater. They disappeared under the waves before stretching farther outward. Marcus crouched. Tide pools. Or rather, future tide pools. The submerged rock shelves suggested that the ocean was currently at high tide. When the water eventually receded, those shallow areas would likely emerge, trapping seawater inside countless rocky basins. He had seen similar coastal formations during several resort development projects years ago. Those pools often became miniature ecosystems. Small fish, shellfish, crabs, sea snails, seaweed, food. His island was larger than it first appeared. Not by land area, but by the temporary ground revealed whenever the tide retreated. That realization eased a portion of the pressure weighing on his shoulders. At least starvation wouldn't be immediate. Continuing his inspection, Marcus noticed several shallow depressions scattered across the rocky surface. Each had collected rainwater. Hope briefly rose inside him. He knelt beside the nearest pool and scooped a small amount into his palm. Its surface looked clear, but appearances meant little. He cautiously smelled it before tasting only the tiniest drop. Immediately, he spat it onto the rocks. Salt. The pool had been contaminated by seawater carried inland during previous high tides. He tested another depression near the shoreline. The result was identical, brackish, undrinkable. Still, not every discovery ended in disappointment. Higher above the shoreline, several pockets carved naturally into elevated rocks had also collected water. Unlike the coastal depressions, these sat well above the reach of ordinary waves. Marcus examined them carefully from below. If things become desperate, they might hold rainwater pure enough to drink. He couldn't assume they were safe without further testing, but they were possibilities worth remembering. His gaze wandered across the rest of the island. No trees, no driftwood large enough to build with, only patches of stubborn vegetation clinging to cracks between the rocks. Some resembled hardy coastal grasses. Others looked like creeping vines or low-growing succulents. Marcus couldn't identify them at a glance. Plants could become food, medicine, or poison. Until he knew which was which, they would remain untouched. Standing once more beneath the crescent-shaped stone formation, Marcus looked over his tiny island. It was barren, harsh, almost empty. Yet years spent transforming undeveloped land into thriving communities had taught him one lesson above all others. Every successful project began with a thorough assessment. This island was no different. Marcus quietly organized everything he had learned so far. Shelter. He had one, albeit a temporary one, beneath the crescent-shaped rock formation. Food. Not immediately available, but the submerged rocky shelves all but confirmed the existence of tide pools once the sea retreated. That left only one pressing concern. Drinkable water. He let out a slow breath. 2 out of 3. Not ideal, but not hopeless either. Marcus swept his eyes across the island one more time, searching for anything he might have overlooked. The rocky surface remained unchanged. Gray stone, coarse sand, shallow depressions, scattered patches of unfamiliar vegetation that still required careful identification before he dared touch them. Other than those questionable plants, there was nothing. His gaze naturally drifted farther, beyond the shoreline and across the open sea. Then he noticed it. His brows slowly knitted together. What is that? Far on the horizon, perhaps 3 to 5 kilometers from where he stood, stretched an enormous wall of white. At first glance, it resembled distant rain, but something about it felt wrong. Marcus narrowed his eyes. He had spent years visiting construction sites across mountains, coastlines, reclaimed land, and developing cities. He had seen heavy storms rolling in from the sea and morning mists hanging over valleys. This wasn't either of them. He observed the strange phenomenon carefully. Rain clouds possessed shape and movement. They rose, they fell, they drifted with the wind. This didn't. It isn't rain. He folded his arms. No, it isn't a cloud either. The longer he watched, the clearer his conclusion became. It is fog. A fog unlike anything he had ever witnessed. It was impossibly dense, not merely thick enough to obscure distant objects, but so dense that it appeared completely solid. Sunlight failed to penetrate it. No shadows formed within it. No hint of the ocean beyond could be seen. It was as though someone had erected a colossal white wall around the world. Even more unsettling, it didn't move. The fog remained perfectly stagnant, forming an immense circular barrier that completely enclosed every direction Marcus could see from the island. The sea remained calm, the wind gently brushed against his shirt, yet the fog stood utterly motionless, like a fence, a prison wall. Marcus continued staring. His analytical mind searched desperately for an explanation. Temperature inversion? Impossible. Sea fog? Not like this. Weather anomaly? No known phenomenon behaved that way. Minutes quietly slipped away, then another, then another. Marcus never realized how much time had passed. His thoughts became completely absorbed by the impossible wall before him. He studied its stillness, its unnatural density, its perfect continuity across the horizon. He wasn't under any magical influence. He knew that much. This was simply who he was. Ever since childhood, Marcus had possessed an insatiable curiosity toward things he couldn't explain. When faced with a mystery, the rest of the world often faded into the background until he either understood it or admitted that he couldn't. That habit had followed him into adulthood. It was one of the reasons he had become an excellent development manager. Every unfamiliar terrain, every unstable foundation, every engineering challenge demanded observation before action. The fog was simply another puzzle, only far beyond anything his profession had ever prepared him for. A gentle splash finally broke his concentration. Marcus blinked. The ocean had changed. The waterline had retreated noticeably. Looking down toward the shore, he estimated that the tide had receded by nearly a meter. Rocky shelves that had been hidden beneath the sea were now exposed to the afternoon air. Dozens of shallow pools glittered under the sunlight. Some were no larger than a basin. Others stretched several meters across. Tiny pockets of seawater remained trapped between the rocks, forming a maze of tide pools extending beyond what had originally appeared to be the island's edge. Marcus's attention immediately shifted away from the mysterious fog. Whatever that white wall was, it wasn't something he could investigate today. Survival came first. The tide pools represented his best chance of finding food, and perhaps other resources he had yet to imagine. Without another glance toward the distant wall of mist, Marcus stepped off the sandy shore and carefully made his way toward the newly revealed rocks. It was time to see what the receding sea had left behind. Marcus carefully stepped across the exposed reef as the tide continued to retreat. The rocks were slick with algae, forcing him to watch every step. One careless slip could leave him injured, and on an island like this, even a minor injury could become life-threatening. His eyes scanned every tide pool. Within minutes, his expression eased. That's more than enough. Clusters of mussels clung tightly to the exposed rocks, packed together in dense colonies. Nearby, limpets dotted almost every flat stone surface, their cone-shaped shells blending perfectly with the gray rock until viewed from the right angle. Scattered among them were sea urchins, their dark spines swaying gently beneath the shallow seawater, a genuine food supply. He wasn't looking at a feast, he was looking at time. Time to think, time to prepare, time to survive. Marcus climbed farther onto the rocky section of the reef and searched for a suitable stone. It didn't take long before he found one roughly the size of his fist with a naturally flattened edge. Good enough. He crouched beside the nearest limpet. From what little he knew, simply pulling one by hand rarely worked. Their muscular foot could cling to rock with astonishing strength. Instead, he waited until he found one slightly extended before quickly sliding the edge of the stone beneath it. Pop! The limpet came free. Marcus nodded with quiet satisfaction. The method worked. He repeated the process methodically. 1, 2, 3, until 10 limpets rested in his hands. The mussels proved even easier. Using both hands, he twisted and pulled small clusters from the rocks before separating them one by one. 10 mussels. Without any bags or containers, Marcus simply stuffed the shells into the deep pockets of his blue jeans. The added weight tugged slightly against the fabric. Then an obvious problem occurred to him. I don't have fire. He stared at the shellfish in silence. Raw shellfish could be eaten in some circumstances, but cooking was always safer. Unfortunately, safety wasn't always a luxury. Marcus raised his wrist and checked his watch. A little past 2 in the afternoon, his throat felt dry. His lips had begun cracking from hours beneath the tropical sun. He had spent far longer than intended staring at that impossible wall of fog. His stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since before arriving on the island. After a brief hesitation, Marcus selected 3 limpets from his pocket. He carefully removed the flesh from their shells and consumed them one after another. The taste was intensely briny, chewy, fresh, not exactly pleasant, but edible. Each bite eased the growing ache in his stomach. As he continued walking along the tide pools, something unusual caught his attention. Half buried between 2 rocks lay an enormous shell. Marcus approached cautiously. It wasn't occupied. No movement, no creature hiding inside. Only an abandoned shell left behind long ago. He crouched beside it. This is huge. Its smooth interior curved naturally into a broad basin, large enough to hold several liters of water. Marcus gripped it with both hands. It was heavier than expected, but manageable. Carefully balancing it against his chest, he made the slow journey back toward the crescent-shaped rock that served as his temporary shelter. After setting it down, he examined it more closely. Years spent evaluating construction materials had trained him to look beyond what something was. He instinctively focused on what it could become. A smile finally appeared. This is perfect. The shell's polished interior was surprisingly smooth. Its natural bowl-like shape made it ideal for collecting and storing water. Exactly what he had been needing. Drinkable water remained his greatest problem. Now, perhaps he had a solution. Actually, 2 possible solutions. The first was straightforward. Rainwater. Marcus looked toward the cloudless sky. This wasn't Earth, at least he no longer believed it was. If that were true, concerns like industrial pollution or acid rain became far less likely. Collecting rainwater directly would probably be one of the safest methods available. The second option required materials he didn't yet possess: a fog collector, or perhaps a dew collector. He had seen articles years ago describing mesh nets stretched between poles in arid coastal regions, harvesting moisture from passing fog. Even a simple tarp might serve a similar purpose, provided he could somehow obtain one. His eyes drifted once more toward the distant white wall surrounding the horizon. Not today. Without proper materials, there was little he could do. For now, he simply hoped rain would come. It wasn't blind optimism. It was an assessment. Marcus stood and rested one hand against the crescent-shaped rock. Despite spending the entire day beneath the tropical sun, sections of the stone remained noticeably cool to the touch. Interesting. He began observing the surrounding terrain more carefully. Most of the exposed rocks were remarkably smooth, their edges rounded by years of erosion rather than fractured by sudden force. Running down several surfaces were shallow V-shaped gullies carved naturally into the stone. Channels, waterways, evidence that rain frequently flowed across the island before draining toward the sea. Marcus traced one of the grooves with his fingers. If enough water travels through these, there was a possibility that tiny fractures beneath the rock trapped fresh water after heavy rainfall. Perhaps not a true aquifer in the geological sense, but enough stored water to seep slowly through cracks. His attention shifted again. Near the base of the crescent formation grew thick patches of vibrant green moss. Oddly enough, much of it occupied areas that received direct sunlight for most of the day. Healthy moss required consistent moisture. Combined with the weathered rock, the drainage channels, the cool stone, everything pointed toward the same conclusion. Rain visited this island often, perhaps not continuously, but frequently enough to shape the landscape over many years. Marcus looked down at the giant shell resting beneath the shelter. He gently positioned it where the natural gullies would likely direct the greatest flow of rainwater. Then he stepped back and gave a small nod. If my observations are correct, he looked once more toward the open sky, I won't have to wait long. Marcus leaned against the crescent-shaped rock, quietly reviewing his situation. Food wasn't his greatest concern anymore. Not yet. The limpets had taken the edge off his hunger, but they had done little to address the growing dryness in his throat. Saltwater shellfish could provide a small amount of moisture, yet they were no substitute for fresh water. In fact, eating too much without drinking would only make dehydration worse. He estimated his limits. If I don't find fresh water, his gaze drifted toward the horizon, by the third day it'll start affecting my judgment. That estimate assumed moderate activity in the tropical heat he had already experienced. He wasn't completely out of options. The elevated rock basins he'd discovered earlier still held rainwater, but those were his last resort. Human pollution was absent here as far as he could tell. Factories, vehicles, industrial waste. None of those existed. Nature, however, came with its own dangers. Stagnant water invited bacteria. Bird droppings could contaminate it. Minerals leaching from the surrounding stone might also make it unsafe. Without boiling it, or at the very least observing it more carefully, drinking from those pools would be a gamble. And Marcus preferred calculations over gambles. His attention returned to the crescent rock. Now that he had chosen it as his shelter, he needed to determine the best place to spend the night. He walked along the inside of the formation, inspecting every crevice and overhang. Most of the spaces were too exposed. Others were little more than narrow gaps between boulders. Eventually, he found one that stood out. The rocks naturally overlapped one another, creating a shallow recess beneath the larger formation. It wasn't deep enough to be called a cave, but it offered protection from above while blocking much of the sea breeze. It'll keep light rain off me, he nodded, and the wind. Comfort could wait. Reliability mattered more. Satisfied, Marcus began collecting several flat, smooth stones from the nearby shore. None were particularly large, but each possessed a reasonably level surface. He wasn't gathering them because he urgently needed them. Not yet. One might eventually become a makeshift cooking surface. Another could serve as a work table, perhaps even a cutting board. For now, however, their value was psychological as much as practical. Years of managing construction projects had taught him that organized spaces encouraged organized thinking. Even something as simple as designating one rock for tools and another for food created order. Order reduced mistakes. Marcus carried the stones beneath his shelter and arranged one directly in front of where he intended to sleep. Then he emptied his pockets, 7 limpets, 10 mussels, the crude stone he had used to pry shellfish from the rocks. His company identification card, its information sealed beneath a rigid PVC laminate. Around his neck still hung his leather lanyard. Attached to its end was the familiar copper J-hook that had once secured his ID. Marcus picked it up. The copper hook gleamed faintly beneath the afternoon light. Copper! Unlike ordinary steel, it resisted corrosion surprisingly well in salty environments. A useful material. Unfortunately, the leather strap attached to it was another matter. Repeated exposure to seawater would eventually dry it out until it cracked. He gently tugged on it, far too short for fishing. Even if he attached bait to the hook, the lanyard barely extended beyond the length of his forearm. Fishing would have to wait, unless he rotated the hook between his fingers. Perhaps the copper itself could be repurposed later. A small awl, a carving tool, a fastening pin. He couldn't think of a specific use yet. Still, useful materials were rarely wasted. Running short on immediate tasks, Marcus summoned the translucent system once more. The familiar interface floated silently before him. His profile remained unchanged. No notifications, no new functions. As his eyes wandered across the display, something occurred to him. There's no clock. He searched the corners of the interface again. Nothing. No date, no time, no calendar, only his profile and the available tabs. Marcus instinctively glanced at his wristwatch. It still ticked faithfully, but watches stopped. Batteries died, mechanical parts wore down. Eventually, he'd lose his only reliable way of measuring time. That's another problem. He dismissed the thought for later. There was little he could do about it today. With nothing else demanding his attention, Marcus reopened the public chat. The messages poured past even faster than before. Some people remained convinced everything was an elaborate shared dream. One lengthy discussion claimed everyone had become unwilling participants in a form of collective telepathy. According to its author, they were merely guests inside another survivor's subconscious. Once the host realized they were dreaming, everyone would supposedly awaken together. Marcus quietly scrolled past it. Another section was filled with complaints. Where were the magical powers? Why wasn't anyone receiving legendary weapons? Someone loudly protested that every transmigration story promised cheats and supernatural abilities. Others responded with sarcasm. Marcus couldn't help smiling faintly. Farther down, the atmosphere improved considerably. Survivors exchanged practical advice instead. One demonstrated how to weave branches into a lean-to. Another explained how to identify edible plants in temperate forests. Someone else shared a simple knot for securing wooden frames. Marcus read every message carefully. A sensible group. He found himself genuinely impressed. Unlike the dramatic stories and comics he occasionally read after work, these people weren't waiting for miracles. Most had accepted reality with surprising speed. They were adapting, thinking, experimenting. Each survivor seemed resilient in their own way, bringing knowledge from different professions and experiences. That, perhaps, was the greatest resource of all. He continued scrolling. Then something slowly began to bother him. People kept mentioning resources. Resources his islands simply didn't possess. I found several fallen logs. Tree vines are stronger than I expected. There are wild berries near my shelter. I scared off a rabbit today. There are boars deeper in the woods. Found medicinal herbs near the river. Wild grains everywhere. Marcus paused. Wood, vines, fruit, animals, rivers, fields, forests. The list continued endlessly. He possessed none of them, not even one. He stared thoughtfully at the chat. At first, Marcus had assumed everyone had been placed on different islands. That now seemed unlikely. The conversations painted an entirely different picture. Some survivors described dense forests. Others lived within marshes. Several spoke about endless grasslands. One claimed to have awakened halfway up a snow-covered mountain. Another insisted their territory bordered a desert. Each environment appeared completely unique. Marcus slowly leaned back against the cool stone behind him. So, they aren't islands. They're territories. His own territory simply happened to be a rocky outcrop barely larger than a modest apartment. The realization wasn't exactly encouraging. He looked around at the 50-odd square meters of stone and sand that now constituted his entire world. A quiet sigh escaped him. Well, he rubbed the back of his neck before allowing himself a wry smile. This is a bit of an annoyance.